Hello and welcome to part one of our Reconstruction unit. Last year in United States History 1, you wrapped up the year learning about the Civil War, the causes, the two sides, and important historical figures, major battles, and how it all came to an end. As we begin this year, we will pick up right where you left off, in the aftermath of the war. As you know, Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which ended slavery in the rebelling states, leading to the Union's win. In the wake of the war, though, there were many unanswered questions. Most of these questions can be categorized under three main problems. How would the country rebuild the South, which had been decimated in the war? How would they go about bringing Southern states back into the Union? And lastly, how could they support all of the now free African Americans? Throughout this unit, we will explore multiple big ideas that will help us understand the answers to those three questions. Because everything is intertwined, each lesson will touch on parts of each question while focusing on a single big idea. In this lesson, we are going to be exploring the contributions and legacies of Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, and Frederick Douglass to Reconstruction policy and the impact these policies had on the South. Let's take it back for a moment to the Emancipation Proclamation. President Abraham Lincoln issued this proclamation on January 1, 1863, after Southern states failed to declare an end to their rebellion. During this time period, news traveled very slowly because it relied on word of mouth and a slow mail system. That, combined with the fact that slave owners were not going to willingly share the news with their slaves, resulted in many African Americans not learning of their freedom for more than 2 years. Juneteenth is celebrated because on June 19, 1865, federal troops reached Galveston, Texas, and announced the end of the war and the emancipation of all slaves in the state. It was at this point in history that the news had reached all of the South. Slavery was actually over and Reconstruction began. Before we dive into what that all entails, we need to know what Reconstruction was. It was the period after the Civil War, from 1865 to 1877, during which the South was controlled by the federal government and social legislation was introduced. It was a time of both literal and metaphorical rebuilding for the United States. In order to recreate this nation, these were the biggest questions government faced. How do we bring the South back into the Union? They seceded during the war to form their own country, and many in the North wanted to see them punished. How do we physically rebuild the South with so much destruction to infrastructure caused by all of the fighting? How do we integrate newly emancipated freedmen, given the fact that white Southerners' opinions of black people didn't magically change just because they'd lost? And lastly, who is going to control and oversee this process? Obviously, there were a lot of opinions and possible plans, but none would make everyone happy. First, let's talk about President Abraham Lincoln's plan. He led the Union through the Civil War and ultimately issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves in rebelling states free. This put enormous pressure on the South, who he believed had no right to secede, and led to the surrender of Southern leaders. Because he didn't believe in the legitimacy of the Confederate States of America, he sought to bring the South back into the Union as quickly as possible, while still requiring an end to slavery. His plan wasn't fully developed before his assassination, which came just weeks after the end of the Civil War. In Lincoln's plan, only 10% of a state's voters had to take an oath of loyalty, and the state had to abolish slavery in order to be readmitted to the Union. For white Southerners, this plan was too far, but for much of Lincoln's party, it wasn't even close to enough. 2 years after the war and Lincoln's death, his party would begin a more thorough plan for Reconstruction, but we'll talk more about that later. On the other end of the spectrum, Robert E. Lee was the leader of the Confederacy's military. After surrendering to Grant and the Union allowing Confederate military leaders to go back home to their families, Lee urged Southerners to reconcile with Northerners and to reunite as Americans. However, this didn't extend to any push for equality. Lee remained silent as white Southerners refused to cooperate. Ultimately, Lee died in 1870 before Reconstruction was fully in effect. After his death, Lee became the leading symbol for the Lost Cause movement. This group celebrated, and many still celebrate today, leaders of the Confederacy as fighters for a just cause of states' rights, instead of a way to maintain a nation based on slavery and white superiority. Lastly, we have Frederick Douglass, an African-American man and former slave. He was a powerful voice for human rights and civil liberties in the time period of Reconstruction until his death in 1895. Douglass was enslaved into adulthood when he met his future wife, Anna. After a threatening encounter with his owner, Douglass became determined that he would escape to freedom. He spent some time in New York City before moving to Massachusetts and then back to Rochester, New York, before finally ending up in Washington, D.C. Over the years, he was the president of the Freedmen's Bank, the first black U.S. Marshal, and several other roles appointed by U.S. presidents. But he is most well known for his work and effort to help create a world where all people were treated equally and with respect. He took a nonviolent approach, advocating for abolition on the basis of slavery's immorality, and this often put him at odds with other black abolitionists. Douglass fought for constitutional amendments to ensure voting rights for African Americans and saw it come to fruition with the 15th Amendment. Now we've got all of these plans and beliefs about how the country should move forward, but what actually comes of them? What policies are put into place? For starters, due to Lincoln's death and his party's belief that he'd been too lenient toward the South, the Republican Party altered requirements to be more stringent. Congress enacted the Reconstruction laws, which required former Confederate states to adopt the 14th Amendment into newly written state constitutions in order to be readmitted into the Union. With the passage of the 15th Amendment, African American men were allowed to vote and hold office for the first time, and many actually did win offices under Reconstruction. State governments under Reconstruction also adopted laws to create a public education system and new state institutions. Finally, to help enforce Reconstruction, radical Republicans developed military districts in the South where federal troops supervised and maintained elections to ensure African Americans were being treated equally. Before Lincoln's death, he saw to the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. One of the questions I mentioned before was how the United States would integrate and protect newly freed African Americans. Well, they had a lot of immediate needs that the government attempted to take responsibility for. Freedmen needed a means for food, shelter, clothing, medical services, and land to work. The Freedmen's Bureau was intended to help meet these needs. While it was well-intentioned, it was never really considered a success due to various issues with funding, deep-rooted racism in the South, and disorganization. Ultimately, African Americans were largely left to fend for themselves. While we look at this list of policy changes and see them as positive, they were received very poorly in the South. Most white Southerners strongly resisted Reconstruction governments and worked to replace them. While they had to adopt these new laws and accept the constitutional amendments, white Southerners worked to deny the spirit of those laws and keep African Americans as close to servitude as possible. Eventually, one state after another came under Democratic control in the early 1870s, and Reconstruction was doomed. That brings us to the end of this lesson. Next time, we will dive into who the radical Republicans were and how Reconstruction came to its untimely end. Take a moment to look over your notes. Do they fully answer both parts of the essential question? What were the policies of Reconstruction and how did they impact the South? Feel free to go back in the lesson to add anything you missed.